let's start with the film. I think Redford says he started thinking of this in '72 when you and Woodward were already working on the piece and on the story. Is it true that he tried to call you, you were like returning his calls, you were not paying attention?
It's true. We got a call one day. Woodward got the call, and it was from Bob Redford. Redford said he was really interested in doing a film about, this was about a year into the coverage, and he was really interested in doing a film about our coverage of the Watergate story. And Woodward came over to me and I said, this is crazy. If we were to have anything to do with such a project at this stage of where the story is, we didn't even know where it was going at that point. It would be ruinous to us for participating in such a venture, and we said, go away, Bob Redford. He was persistent.
I'm always intrigued by the relationship between Washington and Hollywood. And I hear also Katharine Graham was wary of having this film crew coming up. How did they win you over? And why is this diffidence between these two different works?
Well, Katharine Graham was actually really worried and even against the idea of there being a film made out of the book. I think that everybody was nervous about the book too when we were doing the book, and then the book came out. Turned out pretty well from the perspective of the Post. And I think there was a feeling, let's quit while we're ahead here. And at the same time, we all were, and Bob and I thought long and hard, at least we thought we were genuinely exploring the possibility of saying no to a film, though probably in hindsight we were never going to turn it down. But everybody was worried, us especially, about the quote Hollywoodization of what had happened. And so the agreement that we entered into with Redford, who was really the producer and who bought the rights, was that whatever was done had to be true to the book and to what had actually happened. And that remained the mantra through the production of the whole movie. And there were moments when it looked like that. There were some moments that didn't quite look like that was happening the way we wanted, and we all put our feet down and said, no, you can't play with the facts of what happened here. And Katharine is not, I think, one of the really wonderful, how many of y'all have seen the movie The Post? One of the wonderful things about The Post is that Katharine finally gets her due in a movie. But she did not want to be portrayed, and nor did she, really want the Post, the resources of the Post devoted to making a film that was interruptive of the work of the paper. But she also, Bradley finally came around on it, and I think once again there was a consensus that let's make this work, and she pitched in on that.
Last year at Sundance, Redford was talking about the film actually, and he said he had watched it recently, and he watched the Watergate hearings, and he said that what really struck him is that it was they were working across the aisle. And it made me think about the film and about two characters that are so different from each other. They have different political beliefs, and it feels like it's been written as a little bit of a metaphor about working across the aisle. Do you see like that, and was that the dynamic between you and Woodward?
Obviously, Bob and I are very different people, as you see in the movie, and we are, and yet we also, during the reporting of the story and in the 40 plus years since, we reverse roles. That very often, and there's that scene in the film in the car where Dustin Hoffman says what would be expected of Redford to say, and Redford says what you. It's exactly how it was. We would often reverse the expected roles, including Woodward is thought of as a clumsy writer, and I'm supposed to be the really terrific smooth writer. Then there would be days when he would write incredible paragraphs, and in the book. And I would write clunky stuff. And that kind of opposition to the preconceived notion of our stereotypical selves persist to this day, as our wives would tell you. Very often, and we're still close, and very often, you know, and we talk about what's going on in the news and what we're doing, and very often I'll take the role that might be expected of Woodward. He'll take the role that might be expected of me. But no, I don't think there was a metaphor intended for the political process. Obviously, this movie follows Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Butch and the Gentile Kid here, you know. It's a male bonding movie on one level, and then it's this detective story, and it's also about the press and what the press does. And it's about reporting. And what you really see in this movie is it doesn't glamorize reporting. It shows you what the best obtainable version of the truth really is as a goal for reporting, and how you go about that, and how we went about it. And also, I don't think Bob and I recognized when the film came out how central to the movie Bradley is, and his presence and direction, and how he informs what's going on, as he did as an editor. So the movie is also about that process, but in terms of the reporting, you see, it's persistence, it's common sense, it's being a good listener, it's respecting the people that you're covering. Remember, all of our sources were Nixon people, with very few exceptions. They were Republicans. They were not Democrats. We didn't get any information, really, from the Democratic opposition. Almost none. So what you see is how you go about the process, and it's also very significant that this movie, the reporting takes place at night, and if there is a metaphor, I think that it's the day-night part of and that in the nighttime you actually have illumination, and you discover the story at night by visiting these people in their homes, away from their jobs, away from pressure. You could never have gotten this story in the daytime.
As you said, the movie is a great celebration of journalism and American journalism. It took you almost 2 years to get the story, to get to the end of the story. And how do you think something like this would play in a journalistic context like today, where we have a sort of a 24-hour news cycle? How can a story this complicated and with so many moments where you thought it wasn't going anywhere, and then you have to pick it up again, in a moment where attention span is very tight, and
Well, I think it's happening now. We're a year into a momentous story involving the President of the United States. We don't know where it's going to go. We understand some of the basic parameters. We now understand the character of the President, which also took us some time to understand in Watergate. And we are watching with the Trump Russia, but the Trump story generally, a renaissance of great reporting by the major, quote, mainstream news organizations in this country: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, plus the AP, Reuters, plus some reporting by new news organizations, digital news organizations that did not exist, although all of this news is being produced more on the digital platform than it is and online than it is in print. But this is the greatest reporting of the presidency. You see in this movie, we were somewhat alone covering this story. This is not the case in the current story about the President of the United States. There are, every day almost, there are great stories being done by all of these institutions under terrible pressure, under criticism, even more vicious and vile and by the President of the United States, not just his surrogates, than we faced. Nixon, as you see in this movie, tried to make and his people tried to make the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate, rather than the conduct of the President and his men. You see it even more so in the present instance.
There's this documentary that has been made last year on all the president's men, and you have a moment in there which I found that, especially coming from a different country, very moving when you say what really was surprising, what was great, the system worked. So it was a system both politically and the media system worked. Do you think that the system works the same today, can work, or what's?
I don't think it is. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily won't. And I'm not saying that in terms of a definitive result that 9/10 of the people in this audience might like to see, which is to say Trump leaving office or being impeached, or I'm saying the system worked in Watergate because the press did its job. The judiciary did its job. The legislative branch did its job. Republicans, in many ways, became the real heroes of Watergate toward the end, both in the Watergate hearings, Howard Breaker saying, you know, what did the president know? When did he know it? Courageous votes by Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee from the South, conservative Republicans, for articles of impeachment, which made this a bipartisan event so that a consensus in the country could develop that Nixon was a criminal president and had to leave office. And it was Republicans, led by Barry Goldwater, 1964 nominee of his party for president, who, when Nixon, after the so-called smoking gun tape, Nixon still did not want to resign. He thought he could prevail in a Senate trial after certain impeachment by the House. Goldwater led a delegation of Republican leaders down to the White House and sat across from Richard Nixon, and Nixon said, "Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate?" Fully expecting that Goldwater would say, "Mr. President, you're going to prevail." Goldwater said, "Well, Mr. President, you might have 4 votes now, and you certainly don't have mine and the other people here in this room." And the next day, Nixon decided he would leave office. So the Republicans ultimately put principle above party, above ideology, and I think that's the most significant difference. What we are seeing now is an astonishing, not just enabling and craven enabling by Republicans. And what's so extraordinary to me, some of you might have seen me on CNN, but I started saying about 4 months ago that Republicans on the Hill, many were telling me, as well as intelligence officials and military officials, that these Republicans, believed the president was unstable and not fit for office. And yet these same Republicans, most of them, almost all of them, have been unwilling to say it out loud. And since I started reporting that, more and more they have dug in, defending the president, and almost oblivious to the consequences both of his actions, his character, the national interest above parochial and partisan interests, but more than anything, no desire by a movement of this party to learn the truth, whatever the truth is, including the possibility that Trump could be exonerated on the questions of Russia. But we also have one story that now represents a confluence of not just possible criminal action by the President of the United States when he was a candidate or when he was the president, but also matters that go to this question of fitness to be the President of the United States. We've never been in this situation before. So this is something very different than Watergate. But what makes it different is that thus far, this president is being either defended or enabled by the Republican Party.
The unique quality of the situation leads me to what we were talking about before when you said that Trump is not a standalone thing, is a symptom of something else. And can you expand a little bit on it?
I don't know that Trump is symptomatic. I think that there's an evolution. First of all, let's get one thing straight. Donald Trump is a legitimate president of the United States. He won the election. If it turns out that there was, quote, collusion knowingly by him, there's all kinds of ways to deal with that. He's certified, he was elected by the Electoral College. He's the president of the United States. So let's put that aside. He is the legitimate president of the United States. And if you watch what has happened in our political system, and particularly in the Republican Party, but also I would tend to be very critical also of a lot of what the Democrats have done in terms of not building a successful opposition party around a broad national consensus of principles that a large majority of Americans can embrace, that Trump's election is about the country. It's not about Donald Trump. And that includes the elements of racism involved in his election. It includes the fact that he, better than the Democrats, better than the Democratic nominee, was able to connect with and enunciate certain notions about, of all things, working class people, and particularly, let's be frank here, how white working class people have been fucked over in this country. And he was able to connect with that, of all things, better than a Clinton, which is extraordinary when you think about where Bill Clinton came from and how Bill Clinton built his coalition. None of that is to say also that Trump was elected merely by the votes of the white working class or disaffected white working class people, because that's not the case. He won 90% of the vote of people who identify themselves as Republicans. But the fact that given what he espoused in this campaign, out loud, that he could win this election against essentially a center-left or centrist Democratic nominee. Now, a lot of this goes to who the nominee was and her weaknesses. It's extraordinary if you think about it. Even though he got 11 million fewer votes than those cast against him, if you add 3 million more that Hillary got and the votes for the candidates of the two other parties.
I have one more question, and then I will open it to the public. And I want to go back to talk about journalism a little bit. When as you said before, the election has an energized institutional, mainstream journalism to create reporting and to and to invest more resources into reporting. There is also a new ecosystem, which is a new ecosystem, which is social media and all these other much more difficult to control or to influence forces that are affecting what people think about the news and politics. How can we navigate that? It seems like a complete wilderness that it's continually sabotaging.
I think, again, you have to look at politics as part of a larger culture and journalism as part of a larger culture. We live in a very different culture than we did when Richard Nixon was president. We're a different country. Our people are different. The situation of young people is a totally different existence than most of the people, a totally much different existence than most of us of a certain age had in this country. Our meritocracy is of a different sort now. It's been undermined to a large extent by all kinds of plutocratic notions in the last 25 years since the 80s. If you are looking at, and social media, the internet, media itself has changed altogether. The configuration of what we call media, how people get information, but also how they express themselves. Social media is a way of people expressing themselves, and a very frightening way of expressing themselves sometimes if you look at what's on Twitter, or if you look at all kinds of social media sites. So that the ability of rageaholism, among other things, on every side of the political and cultural equation, to become the currency, the social media currency of the day. And also, I don't think you can, again, separate. I was talking to some people last night, a bunch of us at dinner, about social media is also part of selfie culture. It's about me. It's about the elevation of me, and that we all have a stage to express ourselves on without an institutional superstructure, without filtering in terms of a filter as to worthiness. No judgments are made before that stuff goes out there. There is no consensus about this is rotten, this is crazy. It's all on the same plane. So it's a cultural force that we're dealing with here, and the ability, thus, to manipulate information, distort, misinform, disinform, is absolutely huge. And if you then look, and I'll go to the political, I think that Fox News is probably the most important political development in this country in the last 40 years. It's a huge force. It has been a huge force. It has given us a lot of our politics. And that politics, in turn, has been amplified in social media. But also the ugly, uninformed tenor of so much of our culture and cultural and political life, as expressed on social media, is a huge part of who we are today. And not just in the United States. And also, we need to look, if we're going to look at what's going on politically in this country, you can't totally separate it from the rest of the world. All of the democracies, including those of the former communist East, have this kind of division in their countries that we're having here. But here, given who we are and what our possibilities as a country are and what we have done and the meritocracy that we created and have now undermined, and what we are witnessing as a kind of almost denouement in the Trump era, is both extraordinary and in many ways demoralizing. But it's a real reflection of the state of cold civil war that we're in this country. And that state of cold civil war predated Trump. I think Trump has taken it to the point of ignition. And that's where we are right now.
I'd like to open to the public. And, okay, there's one question there. Red sweater.
Yeah. Hi, Carl. Thank you very much for being here. It's wonderful to be here to talk about it. I had a question for you about the level of polarization that we have in all these political debates and position taking. Is that something that was there back in the 70s? And if you feel it's there now, do you have an explanation for it?
I think there was more of a general consensus in this country about both what the issues were that could be honestly debated. It's impossible to have a fact-based debate in this culture today. Not just in the Congress of the United States, but at dinner tables all across America. That the notion of a really fact-based, contextual debate has become damn near impossible, certainly in the state legislature, certainly in the Congress of the United States. On the air, it's terribly difficult. But also within our communities, it's really difficult. There is a kind of, you use the word polarization, a kind of intolerance of the other side, some of which, and incidentally, I don't think this is a totally symmetrical. I think there is more to attribute to one side of what has brought this situation to bear. But it hardly excuses the other side, the fact that it's asymmetrical. And, you know, you look at the great debate, the greatest debate probably in the history of this country, which is the Federalist debate. And you look at the intensity of that debate and the name calling that attended that debate and the brilliant intellectualism of that debate. And as fierce as it was, both sides of that debate were able to agree to the terms of the debate and the real existing condition of the colonies and what needed to be settled. The landscape, they could agree on what the landscape looked like. We cannot agree on what the landscape looked like, whether it is about science, whether it is about political principles, whether it's about the amendments to the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in this place where it is damn near impossible to have a sane, fact-based, contextual debate that serves the interests of the people of the country, the common good, as opposed to the short-term objectives of one side or the other.
Is there a succinct way to explain why facts have become irrelevant?
Never do anything succinct. That's what my wife tells me all the time, as well as many other people.
Well, is there a way to explain why facts have become irrelevant?
I think it's not just facts, because, you know, I talked about the best obtainable version of the truth, which really seems to me that's what good journalism is about. That's the ideal we're looking for in a political consensus based on the best obtainable version of the truth. But it's not just facts, it's context. So let's start there. That the essential other element is you can't just string together a few facts. You need context. So go ahead from there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi. Regarding investigative journalism, I think if you could just talk about the differences between then and now, given that there seems to be so many leaks, so there must be sources, but how do you see the differences in investigative journalism?
Can everybody hear the question? How could compare the investigative journalism then and now? And the questioner said that there seem to be so many leaks. I've never liked the term leaks, because usually you got to work pretty hard to get a good story, and I think you see it there too. We were dying to have somebody run to us with a big trove of information. Would that it happened. and I still don't think it happens all that often today. There are people who have points of view that are willing to share some information that reflects their point of view, and our obligation as reporters is to take that information, see whether it's true, build on that information. If it's false, call it out for false. But I think we're living in an age of great investigative reporting, such as we've probably never seen. If you were to go online and you were to look, even though we've had the death of newspapers and the institutions that those newspapers represented, they're not online either. In most cities of 50 to a million people, those newspapers and those institutions don't exist anymore. But it predates the internet. The internet was maybe the final coffin of those organizations, but chains like Gannett came into towns, bought up papers, didn't give a damn about what the content of the papers were, shut papers down, stripped their editorial budgets. But now, if you went online and you looked at the number of nonprofit investigative reporting organizations, so let's start with this country, and in all of the states, and you were to look at the work that is being done by so many terrific reporters, you'd be astounded. And now look at the investigative reporting that is coming out of every despotic country in the world. Russia, incredible people, reporters being killed, and yet still doing this incredible work all over the world. And particularly as other cultures are having these same terrible divisions that we're having, places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, where authoritarian regimes, Hungary, are increasingly coming into power and clamping down on the press. There is great reporting going on. So I think the reporting is there. We have different civic consensus that might not be as interested or is interested in the same way as, I think very often all of us look at what citizenries do as a failure of journalism. But it's the fact that our people or other people don't act on the information the same way you or I might want them to is not a failure of the journalism.
Speaking of citizenry, there has been made many parallels between Deep Throat and contemporary whistleblowers, Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange. Do you think they are good, they're acceptable comparison or not?
Generally not. I think you have to take them on an individual basis. And Deep Throat is a complicated, Mark Felt, the deputy director of the FBI, who was the source known as Deep Throat, was a very complicated person with complicated reasons for being willing to help on this story. One of the things that's important to understand, and we probably had a lot to do with the creation of a maybe myth in terms of how large Deep Throat's role is or was, because if you watch closely, and especially if you read the book All the President's Men, you see really he's confirming information we've obtained elsewhere, much more than giving. And there's that scene in the movie where where Woodward says, Jesus, come on, give us some information here. So mostly he confirmed information we obtained elsewhere, but what it did was it gave us as reporters a certainty that we were right about what we were reporting, and I can't tell you what that means. If you know that your information is solid, because there's always self-doubt. particularly when you're dealing on this plane and with the, you come to understand at a certain point how momentous the reporting you're doing. Let's not kid ourselves. Yes, you need some real humility, and at the same time, you know, maybe it was like getting in a bath. You start with a low temperature. By the time you're halfway there, you know how hot the water is, and we knew it. So the necessity of being right. I mean, when we make that mistake in there, you know, we were going to resign. We really thought we were going to have to leave the paper. It took us 2 days to figure out what our mistake was. Couldn't even figure it out. That it turned out that Sloan had, that the Watergate investigation by the prosecutors was so in the bag that the prosecutors didn't even ask Sloan, did Holloman control that fund? It would never have occurred to us, but we screwed up. This is back to not being succinct. So, if we're talking about this environment that we're in, Manning, these are people with information and a desire to some extent to undermine a certain institution with the direct intention of undermining that institution or the national security bureaucracy. And incidentally, I think that an awful lot of what Snowden did, first of all, we should never have been surprised by his information. The idea, there's a book called The Puzzle Palace about NSA that was published in the late 80s. It tells you everything about what NSA does. It's a giant vacuum cleaner. The idea that it doesn't vacuum every piece of information, of electronic information that it can get out of the air, we all should know that and do know that, certainly in journalism. And I'm not one who believes that Snowden is a hero, because the one thing that Snowden did that I think has been very beneficial is to show that NSA and electronic intelligence gathering needs oversight. But in terms of a record of that information being abused by NSA, we haven't seen it. It's really very slight, if whatever it is. And so I think there's this kind of conventional knee-jerk reaction to too much of the Snowden story. Anyway, I'm going on here, but no, I think Deep Throat is different. He saw that at the very highest levels, there was a President of the United States and those around him were criminal. And he represented an institution he believed in, an institution with a horrible past on his watch and J. Edgar Hoover's watch and a lot of things that the FBI did, but nonetheless, he believed in the integrity of that institution, and the integrity of that institution was being compromised by the Attorney General of the United States, by the White House, and he was angry as hell about that. He also had personal motivation, I believe, in terms of he had been passed over to be the director of the FBI. So there are all kinds of human factors involved in what he did. But at the same time, I believe, from what I experienced, that his was a very careful reading of what the institutional damage and to the damage to the fabric of this country would result if the information that he was aware of and the information that we were reporting and obtaining elsewhere, that if he could help by confirming it and adding a little texture, he would do it.
There was a question here.
I used to watch Thanks again.
The question was when Butterfield was asked about are there tape recordings during the Watergate hearings. Alexander Butterfield, an assistant to the president, was asked were there tape recording devices, and he of course said yes, there are. And the rest is history, and it made it possible for there to be a record of two things. First of all, the so-called smoking gun tape that established Nixon's criminality in the cover-up. And since Nixon resigned, a total picture of Nixon's years in the White House and virtually every conversation that the President of the United States has. And the question was, is it possible to have any kind of definitive picture like that? Is that a reasonable summation of the question? I would say, to the best of my knowledge, no. I know of no such recording system that exists, and I think that's the only way you could have that.
You watched that when you said that?
Yeah, I knew it a couple days earlier that he was going to testify that. Yes, sir.
One of the things I've always liked about the book and the film is that it sort of valorizes the act of research and kind of emblemizes the fact that any serious researcher is also a kind of detective, which was even more overt in your case because you were investigating what amounted to a criminal enterprise. But I wonder if you could talk about how different the book would have been if Redford, as I understand it, had not said, no, don't write it as objective journalistic history, put yourselves into it, write it as a memoir, and as I understand it, you hadn't expected to do that.
No, we had not expected to write a memoir, because when we signed the contract to do a book, which happened to be the same day that we made the Haldeman mistake, so the whole thing. You see that scene in the rain? We were also in between the two scenes meeting with the publisher. And with our minds totally, there's not saying to each other, there's never going to be a book. Because we got to, but yeah, let's go through with this meeting that we've got scheduled. But the idea of the book, when we signed the contract with the publisher, and you can see how early it is in that movie, was because we had no confidence that the story of what really happened in Watergate was ever going to become known, nor did we know what it was. We had some ideas, and we understood there was a cover-up, but we did not know the whole story at that point. And nor did we think whatever it was that it would ever come out. So we figured we would write a somewhat speculative book about what really happened and what did it represent. But then after the Watergate hearings, when the Committee of Congress with subpoena power, as well as the tapes, which were then under subpoena, the existence became known. But really the basic story of Nixon's criminality was fleshed out in those Watergate hearings. And again, as I think I said, Nixon was a criminal president from the day he took office until the day he left. And that too is a little different than the situation we're dealing with now. And that's another discussion. But the fact that we had no idea where this was going, and then we had the hearings, and all of a sudden it was all out there. The story was known. So at that point, and it wasn't Redford, even though Redford had said, hey, you guys ought to do the story of you, it was our agent who said, you know, you got nothing here that you can write about. Why don't you try to tell the story of what you guys did? And I said to our agent, it's going to read going to read like an ego trip. Nobody's going to want to read this. And so we had already tried to write, even then, we spent about a month trying to write a factual book about Watergate, and it just wasn't working. So Woodward said, let me try something. So he knocked out a chapter. It is sort of like the first chapter of All the President's Men, but it was in the first person plural. And I took it and I said, you know, this two-headed machine, there is no way that we can write a book about we. And I had read and thought that maybe the greatest piece of journalism I had ever read was Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, about Vietnam anti-war demonstrations at the Pentagon. And one of the things that had struck me about the Armies of the Night was Mailer calling himself, right, I said third person, I meant first person, plural. Woodward had written this about we. And I thought, oh, what if we took this two-headed machine and made it Woodward and Bernstein and did it in the third person? So I took what Woodward had written, put it into that, and that gave both a distance from ourselves. It made it possible to write about ourselves with a kind of distance and forthrightness, as well as it worked, I think, as a literary device. And so that's how we ended up with the book that we did.
And you both contributed substantially to the script. After William Goldman did this first draft, and then you really, because the language of the film is so specific to your work.
The shooting of the film was, Bill Goldman had written what turned out to be a brilliant structure for the movie, which is what you see in the finished product. But his first draft of the screenplay was too highly fictionalized in some ways. It just didn't seem to work, and so and he left the project, and there's a whole backstory to that there's no need to go into now. But then a script doctor named Alvin Spielwaller here for film school, Alvin Sargent came in and wrote a rewrite, and Redford wrote some, and Pakula wrote some, and also this film is a great film because of Alan Pakula, your neighbor and mine out here. I mean, the direction of this movie, and it's really Alan's film in many regards. And so Pakula would write some, and then they'd start to shoot, but it still wasn't quite working, so Dustin Hoffman would call me, and Redford would call Woodward and say, well, what would you have done here? What would you have said? And there's an awful lot of the dialogue in the movie that was made up that way.
This one here, yes.
And personally, as a columnist for a local newspaper here, everything is very solitary for me as I create my column from my desk at home. I'm fascinated by all of the newsroom scenes and everything like that, and the action that takes place there. Can you explain a little bit the competition that you had with the New York Times back then?
Well, the competition with the New York Times, we weren't afraid of much, but perhaps, but we were afraid of making mistakes, and we were afraid of being beat by the New York Times. It's as simple as that. I mean, we didn't want to get beat.
Yeah, that's a succinct answer in there.
Okay, there, you got a succinct answer.
Okay, gentlemen.
Just a quick question. As you were uncovering the Watergate story, may I?
Yeah.
You were uncovering the Watergate story. Were you feeling a sense of urgency that this country was at maybe at risk of something?
No. I think the sense of urgency at risk of something. I don't know. I don't think I can process with hindsight quite what all the feelings were about that.
You were excited maybe, but did you feel like maybe something terrible would happen as you maybe have at that point?
I was not thinking in apocalyptic terms, but I thought it was very possible that a criminal president of the United States might well remain in office. And it was obvious to us that he was a criminal president of the United States. Yes, in that sense.
I think maybe one last one here.
Yeah, I actually have just like kind of a nice fluffy question to end on. If they were to remake this nowadays, would you want to carry you?
If there, look, I think the casting of the movie worked really well. I think the movie is what it is. I love what it does. It's not about Bob and myself and our personalities. It's really about reporting. And if we ever were in a time where we need reporting, it's now. So thank you all very much.